Thanks so much, Isabella, for that introduction, especially for your pronunciation of my name, which is quite remarkable and rare to hear. So thanks so much, Ken, for being here. Just let me spend a couple of words about your long biography. So Kent, as most of you know, is the director of the City Science group at the MIT Media Lab. He works in, for example, developing interventions that represent a wide range that goes from micro-housing for millennials to on-demand mobility systems to living lab deployments and in a variety of cities around the world. His book, I just learned on his biography that in 2000, the Unbuilt Masterworks was one of the 10 best books in architecture by the New York Times. How did it feel to arrive at the top 10 of the New York Times list, Kent?
Well, first of all, hola, Daniele, it's good to be here. Yeah, that was great. That book was a little bit of a radical experiment, trying to complete the works of a great master and visualizing buildings that had never been built. So I was pleased to see that other people appreciated it. Nice,
very nice. So the theme of this conversation is about sustainability and resilience and equality in the city context. And I would like to start, of course, we live in COVID times. And an interesting aspect in COVID times is the role of cities, right? Planning at the beginning of the 19th century, density was bad. Then we came in the 60s with Jane Jacobs celebrating the density of cities with innovation. Density is good because it allows the spreading of ideas. And now, we discovered that cities are really good for spreading ideas, but also diseases, right? Exponentially so. So do you think that innovation can coexist with this kind of problem of cities being the exponential vector of diseases?
Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, historically, you can correlate both positive and negative attributes to density. And so on the positive side, density typically leads to more job opportunities, higher wages, more innovation, higher GDP, better restaurants and museums, better education, and particularly in developing countries, more opportunities for women than they find in rural areas. That's still true today. Traditionally, you have a lot of negative things that are correlated with density. Greater stress, overcrowding, increased crime, increased disease, as you mentioned, traffic congestion, noise, loss of contact with nature, et cetera. But I do think that there are ways to design cities so you have the good things without the bad. If you bring together the proper mix of excellent design, new technologies, enlightened public policies. So I think, yeah, with respect to COVID-19, all things being equal, density will lead to greater transmission of a disease like the coronavirus. But I don't think it has to be this way. And if you look at the cities around the world that have been the most effective at managing the pandemic, many of them are very high density cities. For example, Hong Kong, I had a call with Hong Kong this morning, excuse me, and learned they've had a total of 108 deaths as opposed to 240,000 deaths in the United States. If US had the same per capita mortality rate as Taiwan, a high density country, we'd have only 100 deaths.
And the answer was technology, contact tracing.
Exactly. Well, it was technology, it was contact tracing. I think it was a higher degree of trust. I think it's a higher degree of placing a value on pro-social behaviors, but also that just in terms of design, there, if you have an apartment building with 500 apartments, there's a single point of contact, or a high density office building. So there's the ability to do temperature checks and hand washing and, other screening that you could not have in a more low density environment. The highest transmission now in the US is not in the cities. It's in the low density states like North Dakota. If you don't know the states in the US, North Dakota is a rural, low density state right on the Canadian border. They have incredibly high transmission rates. So no, density plays a factor, but I don't think it will determine the transmission. I think it's much more complicated than that.
So it's cultural / behavioral.
I think it's mainly cultural and behavioral, not having to do with density and technology.
So I'm curious. You as an architect, you practice architecture for 15 years in New York. Yep. Do you feel like that architecture studios are going to change the way they design buildings from now on?
Well, I think
office spaces, for example, because I'm seeing a lot of changes, at least in the corporate environment, for office space design.
Well, I think the nature of work is changing. I think that it was already changing before the pandemic, and the pandemic has accelerated trends that one could see for many years. What obviously the pandemic did in terms of work is it forced companies to almost overnight turn to remote work. And what many companies now are finding is a lot of the work, particularly the personal work, can happen remotely. But they're also realizing what can't work, what does not work well remotely, which is, the creative interactions between people, building strong social ties within a group that has to work together, brainstorming, having kind of free-ranging exploration of ideas. And then there's also the loss of the really critical social time together, going out and having a beer after work and talking about ideas. So I think that we will have to redesign workplaces to acknowledge this hybrid future of some combination of remote work and face-to-face work. And I think the buildings in the future will be designed to support those activities that require people to be in close contact. And but we don't quite know how it will shake out. I mean, yeah, I'm an architect, but I think architects are reactive. I think the changes will be made and driven by the needs of the companies, and then the architects will follow. I'm not sure that the design profession will lead the way in determining the future of the work, but it will require really creative design solutions that acknowledge these new conditions.
Yeah, maybe by demand. But the paradox there is that all the solution I'm seeing is that, as you say, right, the social space is something that is the thing's missing, and whereas the personal space of the work desk is actually can be done at home. So the paradox is that if you had to redesign the office space right now, architects are restricting the desk space and then increasing the social space. But in a way, the social space is the thing that is worse for contagious diseases. So there is an interesting paradox that exactly the things we are missing at home are the social part.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's an interesting situation, because we've done work where we've analyzed the patterns of activity in the workplace. We instrumented the Steelcase headquarters back, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And there it was all about trying to encourage the creative interactions between people to design places for kind of informal, serendipitous, interactions. Now with the pandemic, that's exactly what you don't want to do. You want to eliminate all that and separate people. But inevitably we'll get back to that. Actually, I actually think that the other paradox is we're now looking at ways to try to enforce that separation, but the same techniques and tools, the sensing and the interfaces and the design that will keep people separated can then be reversed to create even more rich interaction after the pandemic.
Do you have something in mind specifically on how to reverse an example or reverse use?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an idea that we're working on right now. So that is right now, we know that the transmission of the virus in indoor spaces is largely through airborne aerosolized virus, right? We don't have a sensor that can detect that in the air, but we have proxies for that, like CO2 sensors. We can put in simple PIR, passive infrared sensors, to count the number of people that enter and leave space. We could even use computer vision to look at activities. And that can now be used to then manage the number of people that can safely be in a space, given a function of the size and the indoor air quality and the density of people. If you have great indoor air quality, you can have more people, right?
I see. So you design for optimality, right?
But if we can collect all that data and we can understand these complex interactions of people in order to keep them separated, we could then do the same thing, use the same techniques and technology to help redesign the workplace to encourage those creative interactions.
Optimal social occupancy, thanks to sensors, basically.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. So then the workplace, and then people need to get from their home to the workplaces or wherever they want to go, and there is the transport. Then there is a lot of fantastic work that you have done on transport. How do you think, is it going to change the work, the pioneering work you have done with macro mobility, or how will inform the future? Do you have a feeling?
Well, in the short term, I think it's been, in terms of the region, the larger region, it's been a step backwards, because many people in the city, particularly affluent people, are leaving the city. The real estate prices in the surrounding suburbs have gone up. Housing prices are softer in the city. Restaurants are closed. The museums are closed in the US. So what, the benefits of living in the city really can't be realized now, but you pay the price to live in the city.
Right.
So that means that more people will be using automobiles and driving in and out. But I think, and this is maybe a wish more than a prediction, but I think that will leave, and of course, companies are downsizing, stores are going under, shopping centers are not really viable. I think that will leave a lot of underutilized space in the city, which will hopefully allow for a reset of issues related to equity. I think there may be more affordable housing for people. Some of these underutilized spaces can be used for other activities. I'm hoping that we will then turn towards creating more compact, autonomous, functionally autonomous communities where there's walkable access to everything one needs in daily life, schools and shopping, recreation, healthcare.
Can I ask you this question on this point? So given the situation, right, that there could be room for change. So in your opinion, what is the most important predictor that will predict whether the change will be socially responsible, as you were hoping, or socially irresponsible? So I assume it's political engagement, social activism, but maybe you have a better idea on what determines that?
Well, that's a great question. I would say probably how effectively city governments get involved and proactively help shape the direction of the city. And
so great leadership, basically.
I think great leadership, because I'm not a believer that market forces alone can increase equity and increase quality of life. I mean, look at Kendall Square, where MIT is.
Yeah.
If you're a real estate developer, you only do corporate offices or research labs. And as a result, it's not really a real community. There's no, you've spent a lot of time in Kendall Square. There's no pharmacy. There's no daycare center except for MIT. There's no place to buy shoes.
The ambience is not necessarily cozy and like Somerville.
Because very few people live there. The housing is really expensive there, but I do think there's a way. We have a project. This project I'm working with others at the lab who to try to envision what comes after conventional zoning regulations. And we're looking at algorithmic land use regulations where the community collectively could decide what their future would be, what kind of housing, what kind of street life, what kind of density, what kind of shopping, all of those, and then map incentives for real estate developers and property owners to deploy those assets that the community needs. So it could be increased FAR, relief on parking, could be lots of things. And if you could do this algorithmically, have real time, doesn't have to be real time, but data feeds, get a little too much of this asset, you dial back the incentive, too little of this, you'll dial up the incentive, and over time you could achieve what we think of as a civic homeostasis in a community, which is just a fancy way of saying it's something like a natural ecosystem in harmony, predator prey in relationship, but
or an eBay of desirable characteristics that makes a neighborhood a proper neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly, and so that can't be achieved by market forces alone.
Exactly.
I think it has to be. I think the future will be enlightened public policy, creative people in government harnessing market forces to result in communities that achieve the equity and public health and sustainability goals.
I see. And if you see about, if you think about leadership, do you see anyone that is showing great leadership in the mobility sector?
On the mobility sector, well, I do. I mean, obviously the cities in Northern Europe are doing an amazing job in developing bicycle infrastructure and et cetera. I think the trends towards recapturing the streets for people from cars has been
New York has been great at that, right?
Yeah, and the in fact, I am aware of one city where they had a 10-year plan to build out bicycle infrastructure by 2030, and with the pandemic, they said we're completing that this year. So literally 10 times the rate of development, accelerating it by a factor of 10. So, I think that's happening all over. By the way, one thing that's very interesting, many streets in the Boston area, like in the North End, people were not driving as much. It's very hard to take assets away from people like parking or pathways for cars. But during the pandemic, they weren't being used. So the restaurants took over the street.
Right,
That's much more like what you might find in Europe, where there's outdoor cafes. And now that the people have reclaimed the streets, it'll be very hard to take that back for the cars.
Exactly.
And I think that's happening all over. And that's very, very positive. So I'm encouraged by that. But
that's exactly what happened in New York, right? So in New York, everybody was complaining of why we're closing down. And now I don't think anybody will go back, right? No, including retail shops there.
That's right.
Because they saw the value.
Exactly. So I think it's important to look at the positive aspects of the pandemic. I mean, there are things that we lost that we don't really want to go back to, and things that we've gained during the pandemic that we want to hang on to. And I think we have to be very clear about that. But again, I think it's largely the role of the city governments to set the new rules of the game and, like I say, harness market forces.
Makes sense. So then let's go back on another sort of important issues for cities, which is the housing problem, right? Especially, I live in London now, and the idea is housing there's a shortage of housing in London, and I'm always puzzled. How is that possible, right? In
Sure.
such a rich city, and then we're always short in housing. So do you? And then the solution is high density housing, or is not, or what do we do about this problem of housing that has been around for a bit now?
Well, that's a very challenging issue, but I'll tell you my thoughts on it. I think there are 4 ways one could begin to address the challenge of housing. So 1 is faster, cheaper, better. 2 is increase the supply. 3 is live in smaller spaces. And 4 is reinvent the ownership and financing model. So why don't we talk about each of those for a minute? So
Sure.
the construction industry and the conventional way of approaching the cost of housing is through modularity, prefabrication. And I think that's important, but I think of those 4, that's the least important, because I think the benefit is relatively minor in the larger scheme of things. Increasing the supply is really critical, and that means changing the zoning and avoiding the problems like we first started talking about, that come with increased density, and doing it in a way so you get the good that comes with density without the bad. And I think there are ways, there's a compelling case for most communities to increase the supply. 3 is what we think of as live large in small spaces. So we have a project and now a spin-off company to dynamically transform a small space from living to sleeping to working to socializing, et cetera, using architectural robotics. And I'm very pleased that IKEA will be selling some of these solutions in their stores, and we're working with real estate developers, and Google invested in the company. So I believe that's the future. Still, I think the most important will be reinventing the ownership and financing model. Fractional ownership, so tokenizing buildings, turning towards mutual organizations and sharing of assets. If you, for example, have an apartment or shares of in a building that's available to investors who benefit from appreciation, but the people that live there buy asset tokens, maybe they only own a share of the equity, so that allows them to live in a prime location with a very much smaller equity investment. And if you then can have an organization which is something like a mutual organization, in effect rent to own, where people who are less affluent can over time increase their equity. I think that's it. But in the end, I think we want to pull all 4 of those together, because I don't think any one alone can really deal with the challenge of housing. I'm convinced if you could do all 4, we could make a big difference.
So the third was a small, live large and small.
Live large and small, yeah. That's the transformable space. So for example, we can take a small apartment, say 25, 30 square meters, and rather than having a separate living area with a bed, you have a bed that disappears, goes into the ceiling or goes into a cabinet. So then you have a beautiful bedroom at night that converts to a fantastic living room during the day, and could also then convert to a workplace.
If IKEA is on board, then that's impact a scale, at the world scale.
Yeah. So. And what we found in doing this work for many years is easy is not good enough. It needs to be absolutely effortless and even magical, that transformation. That's why we're using it's really in the end quite simple technology, just the equivalent of garage door openers and simple sensors, but the safety and other and usability is critical to make that happen. But I do think the future will be these dynamically automated, reconfigurable apartments. I mean, it may sound futuristic, but it's already happening today. So
yeah, with archaic technology, but they're already in the market. The need is there, right? It's just that it's not fully satisfied at the moment.
And in the process, you can bring in all
Um,
the other technologies, you know, related to entertainment and healthcare, communication. You could create a sound isolated Zoom studio with a green screen when you need it, and it disappears when you don't. You know, you could bring in learning systems for remote learning for children. You know, I think that really is the future. I think we're stuck in a model of housing that goes back hundreds of years, and it's time to move on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing that I was always struck is especially for social housing, especially in England, less so in mixed housing in US, um, that there was a sort of, it's true that it's important to give a home to people, but always the aesthetic part was considered secondary.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, maybe being an Italian, the aesthetic part is actually, everybody has the right to
Yeah.
beauty. And when you mentioned the word magic, it made me think about that concept, right?
No, well, I agree. And when I talk about the four pieces, the first with the prefabrication and modularity, that offers the potential of democratizing access to good design.
Excellent, yes.
Just like everybody has a beautifully designed mobile phone right now, whether it's,
Right.
you know, even an entry-level phone has really amazing design and technology, but with economies of scale, it's affordable and accessible. I think the same can happen with technology in the home, both design and the technology.
Totally. And we know what happened in Northern European countries in the 50s and 60s and how they democratized them.
Yeah.
Nicely designed objects,
Absolutely.
right, for our home. So one thing that whenever we think about technologies, we actually, as a technologist, we get excited about it. And sometimes I don't think very much, work in the context of a company or a university. We get excited about technology, but we don't think about who can use them, who can afford them, right? So when you design a technology, do you ask yourself, can everybody really afford it eventually, or is not in the design consideration of things?
Yeah, well, I think it depends what kind of technology you're talking about. I mean, I think of technology for cities as falling into three categories. One would be the technology that you experience in the city, you know, the sensors and the devices and all of that. And obviously with economies of scale, that will get really quite expensive, inexpensive, like the phone. The second category is technology used in the process of creating cities. And these are the data analytics, the prediction models, the interfaces to build consensus. And we've done a lot of work there, how to make these powerful systems, these powerful technologies, usable and accessible by people in the community. So yes, I think that's not technology that you own, but that's technology that you use to engage with the community in a richer way to make decisions about their future. And then the third category is technology used for governance. This is like what I was talking about with the algorithmic dynamic zoning, or it can be local token economies that encourage people to keep their wealth in the community and act in pro-social ways, you know, and you know, many other systems related to decision making and incentive policies and things like that. So I think in every case, with when it becomes, you know, widely adopted, like I say, with economies of scale, it will be affordable, whether you're talking about technology in the process or technology that people interact with daily.
Okay, so scale is the answer then.
Yeah,
so we started with COVID, and you told me that trust was one of the most important factors.
Yes.
And let's conclude with trust.
Yes.
So if we had to design for trust, how a city, a building would look like for designing, if it were to be designed for trust?
Yeah, trust is very hard to build. I mean, I'm not sure you can design a system for trust, I think. And it's a really critical issue. I mean, the problem we have with our political dysfunction in the US is fundamentally about lack of trust. And I think we're all trying to figure out how to increase trust. And, but I do think that there's some things designers can do. So designing transparent buildings, for example, openness. I mean, the Media Lab is great in that you walk into the Media Lab and you can see what's going on. So I think one key aspect of trust is transparency. You know, being open, not hiding things behind walls, you know, either literally or figuratively. So, and I think if we can design openness into government, so the processes are transparent, just like we're dealing with now in our election, you know, making the process of counting votes transparent will increase trust. So
one would hope so.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. But of all the things that we need to work on, design, technology, public policy, I would put trust at the very top of the list if we're going to create more resilient, sustainable, you know, healthy communities.
Yeah, I always wonder, because our emotional brain is far larger, the unconscious brain is far larger than conscious brain. I always wonder if trust is actually due to facts or to feelings, right? So how do people sort of create trust? And maybe the transparency of a building is more down to our unconscious perception of trust rather than facts, right? The same parallel in the election. So it's not very much about facts, it's just the way we feel about them in a way, right? So it sounds horrible, but
I think that's absolutely true. And unfortunately, the internet and social media, you know, the early days had all these fantastic aspirations of bringing people together and free access to information, et cetera. And the reality is it has done that in some ways, but it's also created tribes, you know, echo chambers of people who only talk to other people who believe the same things that they believe. It's really separated people into these various camps who don't trust each other. And maybe we need to start, if we're going to have more open, trusting societies, communities, we need to start by rethinking the way we approach social, you know, these social networks.
Yes, and on that note of a more serendipitous future, without these echo chambers, Kent, thanks so much for your time. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully people didn't guess what we could have voted for, but it was definitely a super interesting conversation with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Daniele. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
So we're really